Show the bill passes.
Each year, hundreds of laws are passed in Florida.
More than 200 new laws are coming into effect.
But what happens when the ink dries?
People will die.
Are laws that inspired battles in Tallahassee
We'll clear the entire gallery.
making you safer at home?
After 8 lawyers told me, we can't help you.
It's getting worse instead of getting better.
Not worth mammary glands on a boar hog. It's useless.
Useless.
It's useless.
This year, the Florida investigative team unveiled the Impact Check, an in-depth look at some of the most talked about laws shaping our everyday lives.
It's better to have the law than to not have the law.
Oh, absolutely.
Could it be stronger?
I got to stay away from that one.
We hear about the successes
It allowed me the opportunity to have a voice.
and failures.
Unless everything is covered, then nothing is safe.
And lawmakers get candid about what drove some of Florida's most controversial laws.
The bill should not have been enacted.
This bill makes no sense.
No justice! No peace!
This is the Impact Check with investigator Katie LaGrone.
Hello and welcome to our special report. Over the last year, photojournalist Matthew Apthorpe and I have analyzed a half-dozen Florida laws, from the state's school guardian program to its texting and driving law. The goal to find out if Florida laws are having the intended effect, because we all deserve to know what's working and what's not. In the wake of our reporting, some laws have even changed. So let's get started with a growing crisis that affects all of us. In fact, distracted driving is considered the #1 threat on our roads right now. Phones, the main culprit. Several years ago, Florida lawmakers took steps to curb that danger. But is Florida's law going far enough?
Just 50 miles north of Tampa, in the small town of Brooksville.
And then there's a crashing metal sound, a split second, and it goes black.
Jordan and Brooke Shear
I remember hearing a noise.
recently took the stand
He drove right into the back of the Mazda CX-5.
in a criminal trial that got little attention, but is destined to have extraordinary impact.
I turned around and I looked at Logan.
After 3.5 days of emotional testimony,
My kid was blue with blood running down his nose.
and just 2 hours of deliberation,
The defendant is guilty of reckless driving causing serious bodily injury.
the couple's years-long fight for closure ended when a jury found 39-year-old Gregory Andriotis guilty of recklessly causing this 2016 deadly crash on I-75 in Hernando County. Distracted by his cell phone, Andriotis slammed so fast and so hard into the back of the Shears, their family's SUV nearly pancaked. While the case represents the first cell phone-related distracted driving case to go to trial in Florida, the wreck became a symbol of the dangers of distracted driving and inspired new state laws banning texting and driving. But not before robbing the Shears' 9-year-old son Logan of a life he was just beginning to live.
I always knew Logan was going to do something big for this world.
Because I'm heavy.
But the hard part is knowing that it's got to be from the other side.
3 years after Logan's death, texting and driving in Florida became a primary offense. Now, 4 years later, is it having much of an impact?
This is what we call a clunky law.
Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd is known for his honest on-camera quips about crazy Florida crime.
If that just doesn't rip the button off of your shirt,
Florida's texting and driving law gets him just as fired up.
I think it's not worth mammary glands on a boar hog. It's useless.
Useless.
It's useless.
That's because he says Florida's ban on texting while driving might as well be called the law of exceptions. The current statute makes all sorts of them. Drivers who are stopped can text. Navigation apps are also okay. And if you're suspected of texting and driving, the law even gives you a pass from handing your phone over to police to prove it.
They created this law in this manner so that Florida law enforcement officers would not write many violations.
And so how is that not a failure?
Well, I don't call it a failure. You can.
The Between 2019 and 2021, state data shows distracted driving caused at least 110,000 crashes in Florida, nearly 1,000 of them fatal. But according to statewide totals, starting in July 2019 when the state's new texting and driving law took effect, and through 2021, Florida law enforcement agencies issued a total of just over 8,500 citations for texting and driving. In a state with some 15 million licensed drivers at the time, that's equivalent to just about 9 tickets per day statewide, with several agencies, including sheriff's departments, not issuing a single ticket in a 12-month period, according to these reports.
That's just ridiculous.
For Gwendolyn Reese, the law and its failure is personal.
She was at the beginning of her life.
Her niece, LaVon, was a senior at FSU in 2015 when she was killed instantly after being struck by a driver texting and driving. Reese lobbied in Tallahassee for the state law she knew wasn't strong enough even then.
We said, okay, this is not what we want, but it's better than nothing.
In fact, when it comes to texting and driving laws across the country, Florida is considered to have one of the weakest, with fines among the lowest, just $30 for your first offense. In New Jersey, penalties for texting and driving start at $200.
When the laws are like they are, why do I expect it to make a difference?
One answer, hands-free regulation, which bans drivers from using handheld devices anytime they're behind the wheel. 25 states have already adopted the law. Former GM executive Stephen Kiefer actively helped pass the law in nearly half of those states.
All the states that we've been successful with these laws, the crashes and deaths go down 10 to 20%. It's not a perfect solution, but it is a good start.
Kiefer started the Kiefer Foundation after losing his own son Mitchell to a distracted driver on her cell when she rear-ended him.
We're trying hard to change the world in his honor.
Kiefer, who recently moved to Florida, is now in the early stages of getting Florida to go hands-free too. It won't be easy. Privacy and freedom will likely be issues that stir debate here, even when victims and law enforcement we spoke with say what's on the books now is far.
Unless everything is covered, then nothing is safe.
From working.
It doesn't keep the community safe.
It's hard, it's really difficult being in our position not to just be angry. There's so much that they could do if they dared to do it.
Back in June, Gregory Andriotis, who was convicted in that deadly distracted driving case, was sentenced to 30 years in prison, the maximum punishment. Andriotis is the first person in the U.S. to be sentenced to prison over a cell phone-related crash. Since his sentencing, a new coalition was created aimed at encouraging Florida lawmakers to join more than 24 other states that have already adopted what's known as hands-free legislation. If approved, it would make it illegal to hold a mobile phone while driving in Florida. From reducing dangers behind the wheel to preventing tragedies on the side of our roadways. Another Florida law impacting Florida drivers is the state's 2-decade-old move-over law. It requires drivers move over or slow down when they see flashing lights stopped on the side of the road. But after analyzing years' worth of state crash data, we found the law has largely had little impact on reducing the frequency of roadside crashes and deaths. Among the Floridians killed are Austin Gain and Paul Paez, both tow truck operators and fathers who were each struck and killed in separate incidents while doing their jobs on the side of busy Florida roadways. Austin's mom spoke with us from her son's grave, hoping his death would raise awareness.
It was just a bad deal. It really is. He had his whole life in front of him. He was so excited about just life.
Law enforcement told us most drivers don't know about the state's move-over law, and many drivers get confused about when they're required to move over or slow down. To help clear up that confusion, following our report, lawmakers expanded Florida's move-over law, making it mandatory for drivers to move over or slow down for any vehicle that's disabled on the side of the road. Coming up next, these families call it a law that's cruel, cold, and unfair. Now they're fighting to get it off Florida's books. We'll explain why. Plus, it was one of the most controversial new measures born out of the deadly high school shooting in Parkland 5 years ago. Armed school guards. But are these gun-toting guardians making much of a difference to students' safety on campus? What we discovered after the break. Welcome back to the Impact Check. The next law we're examining brings us into a Florida courtroom. That's because it's a law you've probably never heard of unless you've lived it. Critics call it Florida's free kill law, and loved ones say it's cruel, cold, and keeps them from pursuing justice in a courtroom like this when a family member unexpectedly dies from a medical mistake.
This killed me. Please accept our sympathy for your recent loss.
3 years after her father's death, 33-year-old Sabrina Davis is still fighting.
If it keeps somebody else from being in my position, then it's worth it.
For his life.
I believe that he would want me to keep going and not give up on this because he knew.
It happened in October 2020. Sabrina's 62-year-old father, who was on a blood thinner and had a history of blood clots, went to a Florida hospital for a swollen knee. Sabrina says despite their request to do an ultrasound for blood clots, the doctor refused, ordering physical therapy instead.
It was red, it was swollen. It was so obvious that it was more than a pulled muscle.
A few days later,
he said, "Your dad is code blue. He has no pulse and he's not breathing. What would you like us to do?" And I was like, "You have the wrong patient."
An independent autopsy later revealed Sabrina's father had a 9-inch blood clot in his left leg that traveled to his heart and ultimately killed him.
"Dad, you knew it. You were sitting there with a clot. We both knew it. We both asked and nobody listened." After 8 lawyers told me, your dad is single and you're over the age of 25, we can't help you. I started to think, am I explaining myself wrong? Are they not understanding me?
Critics call it Florida's free kill law. The law states if someone 25 or older dies due to medical malpractice in the state, only a spouse or child under the age of 25 can sue for pain and suffering. Since Sabrina's father was unmarried and she was 30 at the time, Sabrina was banned from seeking justice over her father's wrongful death.
To be told you cannot pursue it's like a punch to the gut. It's an awful feeling. It's like you have no rights when it comes to your loved one.
Passed in 1990, the law was created to attract doctors to Florida by protecting them from getting sued over medical malpractice and rising medical malpractice premiums. But more than 3 decades later, there's no data that suggests this law has worked to accomplish any of its goals. In fact, since 1990, federal data shows Florida consistently ranks among the top 3 states in medical malpractice insurance costs, cases, and payouts.
What's the purpose of keeping this law on the books if clearly it hasn't done what it was intended to do?
Well, I don't think any one individual law or one individual reform is going to change things.
Andy Bolin is a trial attorney who represents the healthcare industry. He's also lobbied on behalf of the Florida Justice Reform Institute to keep Florida's free kill law intact.
I do respectfully rise in opposition to the bill.
Florida remains the only state with such a law in place.
It's certainly not meant to send a message or be overly harsh, but it is an example of the way that laws are made and the way that they have to look at the way they impact, the community and society as a whole, as opposed to in the individual's case.
Those individual cases also include Taylor Jenkins, who was 25 years old, unmarried with no children, when she died earlier this year at an Osceola County hospital after being rear-ended at a red light. Doctors initially claimed Taylor died of a brain injury, but an independent autopsy later revealed Taylor died of internal bleeding that went undiagnosed and untreated for hours. The findings even confirmed by the county's medical examiner, prompting them to change Taylor's official cause of death.
I feel like I'm told her life didn't matter.
For her mom, Florida's free kill law kills any possibility of holding the hospital and its staff accountable for her daughter's death.
It protects negligent doctors and hospitals instead of holding them accountable in any and every way possible. And because that's happening, it makes our hospitals dangerous for everybody.
Which is why Sabrina Davis and Cindy Jenkins aren't staying quiet.
I'm left with the aftermath of other people's actions.
Ensuring lawmakers know their loved ones mattered and how they died shouldn't be protected by a law that isn't solving the problem it was intended to.
I will never give up. I want to see this change. I will never stop fighting. It's just too important to me.
Since our report, several new bills have been introduced in the House and Senate that would repeal all or portions of this law. A bill recently introduced in the Senate would allow these families to file lawsuits as long as the state governing board has already found the doctor or hospital at fault. While the bill could be the first time this topic is heard in the Senate, some family members believe it's a step backwards since the state rarely finds doctors or hospitals at fault in medical negligence complaints. For our next report, we are staying in a Florida courtroom where in 2022, Parkland families spent months hearing emotional testimony and sharing their stories during the sentencing trial for a school shooter. In Florida, that 2018 Stoneman Douglas shooting prompted swift new laws across the state aimed at keeping students safe on campus. They include Florida's school guardian program. It gives districts the option to hire armed guards in place of law enforcement or school resource officers. Later, the program expanded to include teachers who could be armed while working on campus. But we found measuring the program's impact is challenging.
How many mass casualty active assailant events have we had on a school in Florida since Stoneman Douglas? None.
Sounds like really the only measurement of success for this program is the absence of an event.
Well, you know, that's the way you're characterizing it.
And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's the only information that
but see, what other information?
Right?
What other information do you want? What other information do you need? You know, and to a degree, I think you're looking for something that can't exist.
Coming up, if you're getting more robocalls, there's a reason. Still ahead, we discover how money and power in Tallahassee is now fueling a new surge of robocalls across the state. Welcome back to the Impact Check. Now we turn to a nuisance we can all relate to: unwanted calls and texts. In May, a new law took effect that gives telemarketers more leeway to call and text all of us. So I wanted to know why Florida's robocall law went from putting consumers first to backing big business.
We have pre-approval. The reason of this call.
After years of annoying consumers.
If you want to make any change.
2 years ago, Florida lawmakers got involved in the robocall game, cracking down on these nuisance calls and texts by passing the Florida Telephone Solicitation Act. The unopposed bipartisan bill required all telemarketers get prior written consent before they could call or text consumers in the state.
It was helpful.
And even gave citizens the power to fight back through lawsuits if telemarketers didn't stop.
It allowed me the opportunity to have a voice.
Sherry All filed one of the first class action lawsuits under the state's new law. She sued David's Bridal after the wedding gown company continued to hound her with dozens of unwanted text messages, despite her repeated replies to stop.
And the next day I got another one.
This is Sherry describing the ordeal to us back in 2021.
We're now months later and it's continuing.
Within a year, Florida's new phone solicitation law proved to dial back the problem. Complaints to the feds about unsolicited calls in the Sunshine State dropped by nearly half.
Florida had the gold standard.
Consumer advocates described Florida's new law as the tightest anti-robocall law on the books. Having such a positive impact on consumers here, it became a model for other states.
It was the most protective of consumers in the country.
Just when Florida's new robocall law was doing everything it set out to do for consumers like you and me, this year, that all changed.
Say yay.
Yay. State lawmakers brought back the issue, only this time they seem to be less focused on protecting consumers and more focused on helping big business get back in the robocall game.
29 yeas, 10 nays, Madam President. Show the bill passed.
In Tallahassee this spring, while debates over abortion rights, culture wars, and guns dominated the headlines, big business and special interest quietly lobbied lawmakers to change Florida's phone solicitation law because businesses claimed they were getting sued too much.
This is literally bankrupting small businesses.
I could stand up here and tell you about case after case after case of ridiculous lawsuits.
I said, show me one frivolous lawsuit. They didn't bring one complaint in.
That's State Representative Mike Beltran, a Republican from Tampa who sponsored the original 2021 telephone solicitation law.
We have gone against consumer protection and in favor of big business.
Why?
I don't know why.
But campaign finance records we combed through may provide a clue. In the months leading up to this year's session, records show some of the same companies that lobbied for changes to Florida's phone solicitation law
Virtually every communication uses an automated machine.
also donated thousands of dollars to the senator who introduced the more business-friendly version.
Chair Rommel.
Even more money went to Representative Bob Rommel, GOP chair of the Commerce Committee and a big tort reform supporter who wielded the power to move these changes forward. Campaign donations show Rommel's PAC received the single largest contribution by these supporters, $25,000 from the Committee of Automotive Retailers, a PAC led by longtime Tallahassee lobbyist Ted Smith.
What do you say to people who see these donations and say this was a pay-to-play?
I would say that they don't understand the legislative system in Florida or in most states. It's not about influencing votes. It's about assisting good people as they desire to get into office.
Smith also heads the Florida Automobile Dealers Association, one of the organizations that lobbied hardest for changes to the law.
All my dealers really want to do is their routine business practices.
Their efforts worked. By the end of session, the legislature passed a new business-friendly telephone solicitation law. Representative Beltran was the only Republican in the House to vote against it.
The legislation that was passed in this session was anti-consumer.
Money is the only thing that motivated the change of law.
Nobody's seeing a dime of anything.
Sherry All's class action lawsuit against David's Bridal ultimately went nowhere. 2 years after she filed suit, the company filed for bankruptcy earlier this year. But not before it, too, spent thousands of dollars to hire its own lobbyists to change Florida's law.
To get more information,
a law Sherry fears has now changed just enough to bring back the unwanted messages she fought so hard to stop.
If the businesses or whoever it is, the politicians, whoever, if they're the ones making the decisions, making with the money, pushing for certain things, the consumer's the one that loses out in the end.
The 2024 lawmaking session begins in January. It will result in hundreds of new laws. So I'll keep checking their impact as they come online. If there's a law you'd like me to analyze, feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for joining us for the Impact Check. With photojournalist Matthew Apthorpe, I'm investigator Katie LaGrone.